Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second session. This panel builds on the last session. The last session was very much focused on aspects of resilience and readiness, as you've just heard. What we intend to do with this panel is to shift the focus on to one of the requirements of the National Defence Strategy, which was to shift to a whole of government, whole of nation effort in responding to our contemporary crises. We just heard from CDF there, the NDS was released last year. There is now a biennial review, so there will be an update next year. And of course, the NDS is due to deliver in 2030. Now, the sort of challenges inherent in delivering on the National Defence Strategy does imply, a partnership between all arms of government and with industry and with, allies and partners, and that really infers a much deeper sense of integration than where we were. So to that end, we have assembled a great panel of people representative across a range of key players in government and also industry as well. So we have Matt Yannopoulos, the Associate Secretary from Defence. We have Hamish, Hansford, the Deputy Secretary of Cyber and Infrastructure Security at Home Affairs. We have Andrew Downs, who is the Vice President of Strategy and Communications at Thales. And we have Katrina, who is the Acting DepSec of International and Foreign Investment at Treasury. Now, the strategic context you've just heard a little bit about. Of course, there is great power competition. The nature of that great power competition has shifted somewhat dramatically in the last couple of months with the new US administration. We are continuing to contend with hybrid and grey zone threats. We have, climate challenges that we just heard about. And of course, we have, increasingly emerging challenges such as cybersecurity and access to space-based services, to name a few. None of these can be managed solely as military problems. They certainly can't be dealt with just purely military responses. So we do need to look at how all of us work more closely together to both build our capacity to respond, but really importantly, how we can all contribute to deterrence to avoid the type of conflict that the National Defence Strategy, potentially heralded it. So, coordination, cooperation, integration is key. Public sector, private sector, industry, allies and partners. So to kick things off, Matt, what are the most significant implementation challenges to the NDS and how are you working with other departments to deliver on them?
Thanks, JJ. And everyone hear me? Yeah, great. Well, good morning. So I thought I'd frame around three areas and maybe picking up where I heard CDF just as I came in. So our strategic environment. That environment that's continuing to deteriorate is meaning that we have to continue to evolve our strategy and evolve to what we're seeing overseas in the Ukraine conflict and the other. So first risk or challenge that we're dealing with is the environment is not static. And whilst we set the strategy only 18 months ago, we're having to rethink elements of it going into the next series. The second area is our workforce. We are, I think, for the first time seeing growth in the ADF. Our numbers are starting slowly to recover. But we've got to grow to 69,000 by the end of this decade or a little bit beyond. We need those people to operate the platforms and equipment that the NDS has sought. It's an environment of a tight labour market. It's competitive. We want science and technology skills. A modern ADF is quite different from the past, and we're competing against a lot of businesses who are also seeking that science and technology skills. So workforce is the second area. And thirdly, financially, our budget is a challenge. The cost of running our business, of sustaining our older platforms whilst we equip with the new generation of platforms is challenging for us. We have grown as an institution to get after major new capabilities, whether that's the AUKUS submarines or the guided weapons and explosive ordnance, or even the massive shipbuilding program that we're undertaking. And we've largely done that without lots more humans. So we're stretching ourselves as an organisation to achieve that. Now, back to whole of government though, JJ, we're working, I think, very well with our colleagues across government. Whether that's the work we're doing with Home Affairs on the maritime re-equipment for them, or with our central agency colleagues where we regularly discuss the state of our finances and the effort we go to get after our AUKUS ambitions. But the partnership with Foreign Affairs and Trade to balance our environment. This strategy that we're embarked on requires us to operate across the Commonwealth and indeed with our partners. And I'll pause there and say there's lots more we can talk to, but it's busy work.
Great. Okay, thanks, Matt. So, Hamish, given the increasingly complex set of challenges that we've got, and we've mentioned, from cyber to instability to climate and these sorts of things, how are Home Affairs focused on helping build resilience, but also working with other departments to do that?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think the National Defence Strategy doesn't sit in isolation, as Matt said. We've really got two key levers. The first one is all about the nation's prosperity. And so we've got the levers for two-way trade into the country, for the complexion of the migration program, making sure that the people who come to Australia have appropriate security settings and that we're welcoming people to contribute to the national interest. And so we've got a very strong prosperity role that leads into the support for things like the defence industry. And so making sure that we're connecting our overall regime into what defence is trying to achieve, I think is really the first part of our role. And then on the threat side, Matt's already mentioned our Australian Border Force maritime capability that we're working so closely with Defence on. But we think about the nation more holistically, and we are preparing the nation to be much more resilient and to be able to bounce back from any sort of threat that we face. And so at the government level, we're really pulling our protective security setting lever to try and make the government as secure as it can be. And if it was subject to some sort of incident, whether or not that's a trusted insider issue or a cyber incident, to be able to bounce back and respond. Same thing with infrastructure. We're working every single day with our critical infrastructure partners and deep into their supply chain to have the reliance for the defence industry, the Defence Department, the Australian Defence Force and a whole range of stakeholders to have trusted, secure and resilient infrastructure that can bounce back from any incident. And we're on a pathway, particularly since 2018 with the legislation in the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, which we've now amended a range of different times, to really work out which infrastructure are we trying to protect in what order and what are the most consequential and highly interdependent infrastructure in the country. And so we have, for example, 224 systems of national significance that we know what their plans are to respond to a cyber incident. And that all goes to a much more resilient economy. And then perhaps the more difficult end is every single Australian. And we've now had a legislated Cybersecurity Act, which starts to bake in things like baseline standards for Internet of Things products. And so at different levels of the economy, we're thinking about resilience, which ultimately go to helping the Defence Force and the Defence Department implement the defence strategy.
Great. So, Katrina, the aspirations of the National Defence Strategy are, grand. What do you see as the most significant economic and budgetary challenges to delivering on the defence strategy?
Thanks very much. And look, I promise you I'm not wearing all black because I'm trying to be the conventional Treasury official on this panel here today, but thanks very much for having me. You would expect sort of from our perspective that a strong economy is a key foundational plank of national security, but Equally, I think one of the things that we've seen a lot of discussion about over recent years is that national security is also a strong foundational plank for a strong economy. And so there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of debate in recent years about the linkage and the extent to which these things are intertwined. So I hope this quick overview that I give will be sort of in concert with Matt, consistent with the discussion or themes here today about collaboration, cooperation and those sorts of issues. So just for a really quick overview on the economy, for the foreseeable future, we think uncertainty in the economy will be higher. Economic forecasters always tell you there's more than unusual uncertainty. I think what we do know now is that uncertainty is here to stay and will be higher for much longer. The tariffs that we saw on 3 April were more substantial than we expected. Since that time, we've seen higher levels of volatility in financial markets. We've seen downgrades to the global outlook from the IMF. So in terms of how we expect this to flow through to our domestic economy, conventionally we think about things through a trade channel, a financial channel and a confidence channel. On the trade front, we expect to see lower demand through lower exports. Given the uncertainty, we would also expect to see weaker consumption, lower business investment. Disruptions to financial markets would only further exacerbate these effects. And so in this kind of world, from a policy perspective, we really do need to focus on things that do strengthen our resilience, that make us more flexible, not less, and that increase our productive capacity in the economy. Amidst a bit of that gloom, I did want to touch on a bit of a bright spot, which definitely gets to the question of the NDS, which is around the labour market. I've been in economic forecasting for a while, and if you had said to me at the beginning of COVID, which I know you remember very well, that we'd have a labour market with a 4 in front of the unemployment rate for an extended period, I would have been pretty surprised. And I don't think we saw many forecasters with that. But what we have seen now is we've managed to have a low unemployment rate, high participation, a high employment to population ratio for some time. So all of which, when I think about the NDS, does present a really interesting challenge. You think about the defence industrial base. That industrial base pulls from a lot of those sectors that are adjacent to sectors that are already experienced tightness. Construction, there's a strong pipeline and a housing agenda, and similarly with infrastructure. So when I think about the economic piece, it's certainly the labour market and the labour force, which I know is very much on defence mind around the NDS. And lastly, on the fiscal story, jokes aside with Matt, we are facing a really tight fiscal environment. The pre-election and economic and fiscal outlook showed an underlying cash deficit out over the decade, and similarly, like many economies, gross debt isn't predicted to decline significantly. So this does create a tough backdrop to manage the geopolitical pressures that we're facing. There's many parts of the budget that are growing faster than GDP. Interest payments, the National Disability and Insurance Scheme, and of course defence. So while I guess the question is framed in terms of challenges, hopefully I might come back to some of the opportunities that this will present a bit later.
Sure, thanks. So, Andrew, moving from whole of government to whole of nation infers bringing in the private sector. So what role do you think the private sector can and should be playing in responding to the National Defence Strategy?
Yeah, I think there's a huge case for optimism here, and I appreciate it's challenging to think about how does everyone here contribute to deterrence, but especially in the private sector, you absolutely do. And the reason why I say that is because traditionally we think that deterrence is largely found in the capability of the ADF, within the force in being, and it is. I was proud to serve in it. But if I'm an adversary, I'm also looking at what is the industrial base of countries that I may have challenges with. And if I look at an industrial base that is strong, that is prosperous, that has a productivity agenda, which I know is going to be a key priority for this term of government, that also creates a level of uncertainty in my mind if I'm that adversary, because I have to think, how quickly can that country scale? So whilst Hamish and Home Affairs is absolutely focused on how do we provide security and resilience to the industrial base and our nation's institutions, there is a case also, though, for how does those institutions and that industrial base assist security. Because if I've got an industrial base that has a low level of latency, that can quickly produce things that maybe would be unaffordable or uneconomic if we were to produce them in the volumes like CDF spoke about, warehouses, for example, full of drones, that maybe those drones, their rear link was radio frequency, which we know in Ukraine is increasingly not a thing. That's why they're now all spooled. Would that have been a good use of resources? Maybe, maybe not. But if I've got an industrial base that can turn them on a dime, well, I don't need to make those investment decisions as a nation. So there is a very rich conversation and a conversation that we need to have as the force moves from a balanced and joint to integrated and focused. What does the industrial base do? And it can't remain the same. And then when we think of all of those technology stacks that exist in the private sector, and we look at the history of how technology has played in defence, the innovation is going to come from companies that may not even be represented in this room. So I'm arguing against my own book here, don't tell my boss, right? But there is a huge benefit from how we harness the productive forces in the Australian economy that creates a deterrence all in of itself. So we are absolutely all in on this mission, and in a way that perhaps maybe folk here wouldn't have thought about originally.
Okay, so following on from that, what inhibits us getting the best out of the partnership between government and industry at the moment, do you think?
I'd actually say the partnership is incredibly strong. I think where we can do more is examine perhaps those non-traditional players in industry, the organisations represented in the tech fit, the sort of adjacent to the university's foreign interference task force. What we learnt when we, I think, brought that group together was that, yes, a lot of those industries are under challenge, under security challenges, but those industries themselves offered the solutions to those challenges. A lot of companies who experience supply chain vulnerability are also the companies that can potentially innovate through the deployment of AI and the like supply chain solutions. So how do we, as governments, start... sorry, I still talk like I worked for one. How do we shift, I think, big picture from the economic rationalism that we had when the Berlin Wall came down, that post-Cold War peace dividend that pervades all of our thinking, that pervades how we audit and how we assess and how we contract, to then how do we have the industrial policy for a world of geopolitical competition, for statecraft. It is a fundamental change in mindset. And so I'm absolutely confident that the government's up for that bigger conversation.
Okay, thanks. All right, look, shifting a bit further afield now, some of the NDS challenges are about deterring things in the future, but a lot of it is about responding to our immediate context. Matt, in terms of an increasingly contested, near region, the Pacific, challenges we're facing there, how do you think we can better work with other government departments and even with industry to better respond to those sorts of challenges?
John, I would say we don't say enough how much we've changed and how much better we're working together. Mm-hmm. So it's always asked as a deficit, like, what else are you going to do? And, I was in defence many years ago and came back just post-COVID. And now it is natural when a new issue emerges for us to pick up the phone, get DFAT around the table, get central agencies around the table. We are working very effectively across, in my view, across the public sector, with states as well as federally. Where we still need to go is to work better with industry, to have classified conversations with industry, with trusted partners, so we are mobilising the supply chains and that innovation that was talked about. To build more resilience, because I agree completely, that is a deterrence. If we show up looking like we are well joined up as an economy across both the private sector and the public sector, that would set us apart. I think we're also increasingly just working so much better with our near neighbours. I can see a couple of ministers in attendance today. That is been growing and strengthening over the past while. So I guess I'm not answering your question because I think we're actually on a really good trajectory. I think the opportunity with the Defence Industrial Development Strategy and the refresh that will happen can potentially strengthen further how we work together. I think investing in cyber and investing particularly in how we secure those conversations with each other to widen the resilience in our supply chain, that's an area I think we will need to think about and get after in the next strategy.
Okay. So again, Hamish, flowing from that and hoping to pick up on some of the bits that Matt didn't go to, some of these hybrid grey zone type threats that we're experiencing in the region, of course, you can't look at them as purely domestic or foreign. You know, there is an overlap there between, you know, here at home and further afield, and how the agencies coordinate to help deter or defeat those sorts of threats. So, you know, where do you think we're at the moment in terms of all of the agencies, you know, whether it's, you know, defence, policy, intelligence, security, working to help build better resilience to the sorts of hybrid grey zone threats that we're experiencing?
Well, probably it wouldn't surprise you that I agree with Matt. I think we've got some of the baseline frameworks in place, and we've worked very hard on some of those settings. But as you say, the threat environment is changing so much. We need to fundamentally change our collective thinking about how do we approach things in a much more joined up way. And Kat and I sit in a lot of meetings together thinking about the economic side and the security side. And I think the security community has, for a very long time, thought about blunt responses to security threats. I think we've got to get much better at thinking about layers of mitigation and, most importantly, being able to bounce back and respond. And so we've effectively, I think, as an economy, put in place some of the baseline preventions, but we've got to transition our thoughts to how do you actively respond to things in real time, and how does that be, or how is that institutionalised across government and business? And so I think that's a bit of a foundational change. Equally though, we've got to start thinking about threats in a different way. And so even if you look at things like the heads of security for ASIO, they're very lined up. We've got to start thinking about how do people use multiple tactics to disrupt the Australian economy or the Australian defence establishment and force, and how does that come at us in a different way? And so even within Home Affairs, with the recent changes that the government announced to bringing some of the law enforcement and security functions back into the department, we're thinking about how do we gear ourselves up for a much different environment, and how do we bring our national security people together as a profession to work out what are the common issues between foreign interference, cybersecurity, counterterrorism, sabotage, all of the issues. How do we gear ourselves up for an effective policy and operational response? I think that is the fundamental challenge. And kind of drawing on your question from earlier about industry, one of the big things that I think we have learned is we've got some of the baseline settings in place, but now's the time to co-design both the problem and the solution. And so one of the things Andrew mentioned was TechFit, the Technology Foreign Interference Task Force that Minister Burke chaired earlier this year. Really, we came to the meeting with a whole bunch of stakeholders, and we didn't quite know what the outcome would be. And I think that's as it should be, because Often government goes and says, here's the piece of legislation we want to change, here's the capability we want to purchase, but actually co-designing the problem and the solutions, and to Andrew's point, actually thinking about who can mobilise and respond in a different way, I think is the thinking that we need to have more and more to supplement some of the things that we've already done that are successful.
Okay, so I'll ask one last question of you, Katrina, and then we'll throw to the floor for questions. Now, I agree with what a number of the panel have said about government departments are better at working with each other now and are more practiced at it, and we've had a lot of experience in recent years. But you still get to a point, though, where having the ability to coordinate freely across government departments does become a challenge. And also a very significant challenge in that is budgetary control and how budgetary silos work across departments at the moment. So the question here is twofold. Do you think when it comes to the sort of whole of government coordination on national security that the NDS refers to, do we need more formal structures, either a more formal central coordinator or a more formal central coordinating National Security Council perhaps, but one that does have real budgetary influence?
Thanks for that question. I'm not sure I'm going to give you a deeply satisfying answer though, so we'll wait and see. There's been lots of people who've written about different aspects of the national security architecture. I know Justin, Danielle have written previously about national security councils, national security advisors. I think Nick Warner's made some contributions in this space, and I'm sure many, many people for many years. And we've tried lots of different systems across government over time. Interestingly though, when I had a bit of a look through some of these contributions, budget didn't actually feature all that high. A lot of it was about policy coordination, people with expertise across both the domestic and sort of national security front, and issues around strategic communications with with allies and partners and publicly. I'm not going to wade into those areas. They're areas that I'll let wiser heads wade into. But getting on to the question around budgetary influence, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read, Stephen Kennedy, my secretary, had a fairly wide-ranging ABE speech last week that went into issues around national security. We talked a little bit about the budget, and he made what's a really obvious, but I think is a consistently salient point, which is budgets are about priorities. They are about choices. They require a really careful balancing of the goods and services that the community's demanding, and at the same time, the amount of tax that citizens are prepared to pay over time, and issues like preserving our credit rating for a small open economy like Australia is a really important issue. And so having done a lot of budgets in my time, these trade-offs are things that you inevitably have to grapple with around the table, trying to balance a lot of different equities. You can bring coordinating forces to it. I'm not sure that I've got a really strong view on that, but the key thing is about how do you get all of those equities around the table to make those trade-offs. They are never easy, but they are always about choices. But what I also wouldn't want people to think, and I think Matt and Hamish have kind of touched on this quite a bit in their remarks, is that even though I'm at the end of the line here, there isn't sort of an economic camp on one end and a security camp on the other. I think the really important piece about getting these things right is around culture, is around that culture of collaboration, is around that culture of communication, is around the culture of listening. And I think there have been a lot of changes in recent years to try and facilitate that. From a Treasury perspective, for example, we now sit on the Defence Investment Committee, which we didn't used to. I'm sure Matt loves it when I turn up. But we do now sit on the Defence Investment Committee. We do also sit on the Deputy Secretary's Committee for National Security. So there have certainly been efforts to try and bring in that broad set of perspectives to all parts of that discussion, right from the investment phase all the way through to the decision phase. So could you do things differently with coordination? Possibly. But I'm not sure that fixing coordination would solve what are important cultural issues.
Okay, great, thanks. And having said that, with the last question, I will just ask one final one of you, Matt. Just CDF mentioned it and it's just come up again then. The biennial review that is obviously underway, can you give us just some insights into sort of how that's sort of happening how it's progressing and how, again, the whole of government is touching it.
Yeah, so we're in the midst of it now. So it starts with, the cycle started early this year with a threat assessment being developed by the Defence Intelligence Organisation. So an all-source, like what is happening, what needs to feed into the strategy cycle. We then do a net assessment process against potential adversaries, the capabilities they have, the capabilities we need to win. We then go to government, and we'll go to government later this year, to seek some parameters around the National Defence Strategy. There'll be financial parameters, but also policy parameters. One of the things we're discussing right now since the Trump administration changed is, does self-reliance need to come back as stronger in our narrative? That's not self-reliant by ourselves. Our entire intelligence community is underpinned by the US alliance and the technology that provides for us. But do we need to be able to do some more things ourselves? That work is underway. It will be heavily consulted across our agencies on its way to, I'm sure, a few appearances at the National Security Committee before it's released early next year. But those are decisions for government. It's clearly a debate happening in the public domain right now. But we are doing the hard work to work through the analysis of what is happening and what does that mean. That 2-year cycle gives us a bit more flexibility to iterate versus completely start again each time.
Yeah. All right, fantastic, thanks. All right, we will throw to the floor.
Danielle Allen Piper from the National Security College. Thanks very much to all the panellists. This morning we've heard a lot about greater cooperation between Commonwealth agencies. Joe Buffoni made a really interesting observation about better harnessing spontaneous voluntarism. We've heard about the need to become more independent. But what we haven't heard about is how the Commonwealth is better working with state governments to achieve this. After all, we're a federation, and we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that we didn't do cooperative federalism perhaps as well as we could have, although of course that's a matter of opinion. And if we just take, for example, that 30% of ADF recruits come from Queensland, I'm wondering how our national resilience conversation could better employ mechanisms of a cooperative federalism and better involve state governments as well.
Hamish, would you like to have a crack at that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the short answer is on the security side in particular, and even on the immigration side, we are working with so many different state partners. And examples of that is when you're on the weekend and you have a signal chat with all of the state and territory chief information security officers, you work out that collaboration is in real time, particularly when it relates to cyber incidents, and the coordinator and ASD and myself are engaging with states and territories every day on those issues. Equally, we've formed a really strong partnership with states in our Critical Infrastructure Advisory Council, which is kind of the peak advisory body on critical infrastructure issues. That's where states and territories, the Commonwealth and industry are collaborating together, and often that's not seen publicly. And but the collaboration is happening all the time with states and territories. Can we get better? Absolutely. But I haven't seen collaboration with states quite like it is in the security domains, and we're all grappling with some of the same issues, particularly in terms of the security of our government systems, thinking about individual victims, and how do we start to actually form up a better national response. And I think it's always a work in progress, but as best as I've seen it.
I'd just add to that and say the work we're doing with the South Australian government and West Australian government is unprecedented for defence. Like, there are meetings happening between the premiers and defence officials on a monthly basis as we go after our AUKUS and shipbuilding endeavours. Like, there is a lot of connectivity to to achieve these nation-building objectives. And then, under disaster resilience, Joe Buffone has played an enormously successful role in representing the Commonwealth and trying to only use the ADF as a last resort. And that dynamic is working with state governments as each new flood or emergency occurs. And so I would say it's never done and never settled, but I only see positives in the way that we're interacting between federal and states at the moment.
Is an industry view on federalism?
You'd be surprised how much we rely on state governments, largely in workforce, largely in skills, and increasingly, when we think of cooperative federalism, when I think of the challenges in the relatively shallow labour markets of Perth and Adelaide, some people here would remember the workforce challenges that happened with the mining production investment boom in the 2000s. You couldn't get a tradie for love nor money on the East Coast. I don't think anyone wants that to be repeated as we step into that big shipbuilding.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, bad for productivity, right? Bad for productivity. Those state governments are actively looking at how do we do things that this nation's never done before, which is have whole of nation labour mobility using the depth of the East Coast to support the West Coast. And I've got to tell you, having worked in as a press secretary in a state government, that's a hard conversation to say that actually the jobs may not just be homegrown, and that especially if you're on the other side of the coast, that they might be coming from 4 hours away. Again, I want to be an optimist here. I've never seen it better in terms of how the states and the Commonwealth and industry are working together on these challenges.
Anything, Kat?
I just think all of the issues around resilience are inevitably going to end up as a national endeavour. So when we think about the productivity part of the story, and I totally agree with you, sectors like agriculture and mining are amongst the most productive sectors in our economy. As we look to scale up the defence industrial base, we don't want to be plundering from these really productive sectors while we're building up that industrial base. It's really important that we do this as a whole of economy and whole of nation type of effort. And when it comes to the economic waterfront, we've been working really closely with the states. And so as part of the strong agenda around productivity and competition, we've got the National Competition Policy, which has been established, which is a range of different policies working through with the states, things like planning and zoning, where you set up a range of different structures and incentive payments to try and build up that resilience, to try and get that reform going, to ensure that the economy is more productive.
Yep. Hey, I'll just add some personal experience here from COVID, because I think this is an important question. In times of crisis, working across all the federal government agencies and then trying to coordinate across all of the different state and territory agencies, that it is an immense challenge, right? And it doesn't necessarily get easier in crisis. It can get harder because of emotion and sort of particular interests of the states and territories at the time. But a really good example that I don't think is broadly understood is the National Defence Strategy directed the establishment of a National Fuels Council. It's co-chaired by Defence and the Department of Energy and Environment and all the other things that they have. But in my last role, I was one of those co-chairs. It brings together all the federal departments, it brings together all of the states and territories, and it brings together the peak bodies of the important sort of fuel and energy industries. And for the first time, we have actually got a body where we know what the national demands for fuels and energy would be, what crisis or conflict might mean to that. And we've got not only a better baseline understanding, but we've already now got some structures in place to how we might manage prioritisation through those crises. So it is a good example of where the NDS has directed better collaboration across federal and state and territory governments. Okay. Yes.
Hi. Yvonne Butler, National Security College. Hi, Matt. Question for you. A critical part of any strategy implementation is not only the monitoring of the progress, but also the monitoring of the behaviour changes. I know that Defence doesn't have a scorecard in the traditional sense, but uses an integrated performance framework to monitor progress. Given how important it has been, and you've highlighted very well the interaction between the other agencies, given how important CDF noted that it's a national defence strategy, do you see a role in this new strategy for a more integrated and perhaps transparent scorecard that might help two levels? One is our community, and as Joe was talking about, getting that community engagement, the social licence, as we need to move into a different type of threat environment, but also helping decision makers around funding to be a little more aware of the progress that is being made, yet the prioritisation decisions that have to be offset.
There's a fair bit in that question, Yvonne. Let me start by saying we've had the encouragement of the ANAO's first year entry to our auditing of our performance statements. This is a function of our annual corporate plan, and they've been in assisting us to get much better at measuring our performance as an institution. And it's actually, it's helped me, because one of my day jobs is to try and improve performance management and the assessment of our achievement against our objectives. Just a quick, example. I used to have a measure for intelligence that was all operations are informed by intelligence. Kind of of course they are. What we've now developed is a survey that the Chief of Defence Intelligence sends out to all of the consumers. Is it useful? Did it help you plan better? Did it help you in the achievement of the outcomes? So we're trying to, if you like, build this measurement approach across the business. A little while ago, only 3 weeks, I've put a major new ERP system in Defence. It took a little while in the achievement, but now we can see the entire institution. I can see the 4 structures, I can see the material, I can see its status. And so I can feed Secretary CDF now with close to real-time information on our preparedness. Now, what we do with that in a public transparency sense is still to be decided. We would like our adversaries to work harder to understand our deficiencies than for me to broadcast them on the internet. And so, but we need to actually understand internally and with our partners in industry and other agencies how things are going. I take from your question, sometimes it's not clear how we are going with project delivery. It is far too often said that we're not good at project delivery, and if we get given more money, we'll waste it. That is not my view. In 3.5 years of being in this job, occasionally, yes, we do not do well on a project, but the vast majority are delivering and delivering in accordance with the strategy. And so we have to find a way to tell that story, to explain it to both government of both flavours, so that we can argue more effectively for resourcing. But also to build the culture that says if you work in defence and our industry partners, you're successful, and here's the measurements and metrics that make it evidenced. Thanks.
Great. Any other panellists have a view on scorecards?
I think Matt's right. ANAO is actually driving us all very hard to say, of your performance, it's not good enough to say, here's the number of people and here's the outcome, but what tangible difference are you making? What do your stakeholders think? how you're actually improving productivity. I think that's actually an APS service-wide issue, which really gets us to reflect on some of the issues that Kat was raising about productivity. How do we effectively become more productive? How do we make sure that we're having the most amount of effect? And if we're not, having the honest conversation about how do you readjust? And I think Defence, Home Affairs, Treasury, the same issue. ANAO is really challenging our own sense of performance.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments to all the panel. My name's Sarah Pavillard. I'm from an advisory firm called Ret'd, but I also wear a couple of other hats. I sit on the board of the Australian Industry and Defence Network and am involved in the innovation ecosystem. My question is actually about industry mobilisation, but I want to give two examples before I come to the question. With our advisory business, we have been working for nearly a decade mobilising Australian small, mid-market and large businesses into defence and the national security sector. So we've got experience taking a business with zero expertise in defence but some tangential capability and not only getting it defence ready but moving into production in some instances. But we have boards and businesses really grappling with the why for defence. Why should we be contributing more broadly to the national security environment, and why should we be trading off our productivity in other sectors that are delivering the commercial outcomes to maybe our single owner, our family office, or a small number of shareholders. So the two examples I have is a firm we've worked with recently is in the food manufacturing business, and a year ago they were doing no work with defence. They're now working actually in the Thales supply chain, prototyping and potentially delivering large-scale manufacturing in the munitions space, a Riverina business. The other business that's a great example is electronics manufacturer we actually just saw last week. Huge balance sheet, a lot of capacity, but they don't have a why to make the investments to step up their security posture without contracts. So I guess my question for the panel is, what can we be doing better, particularly in this next cycle of the National Defence Strategy, to engage with the relevant business that's not in this room today across not just the huge Australian, ASX-listed companies, but into the mid-market and the small to medium businesses that generate so much productivity for the Australian economy.
Okay, so I think at the heart of this is incentivisation of industry. But Andrew, you've worked defence, government and industry. Would you like to?
Yeah, I'll take a dive on that. The challenge you identify is how do you deploy your capital vice the ROI on it, and it's a good question, right? Because it's a question I get all the time because I run a pretty big civil business as well. So how do I respond to shareholder need in that? So what do we know about investing in national security? Generally, you're going to be working in national security over decades with that investment. So you can start to then frame your investment on a different horizon, which means your ROI may be potentially lower, but your risk may be not as great in, say, in some more short-term things. What I would say also is be wary of the dangers of concentration, because if your business, and we see this all the time, firms that aren't diversified, that are relying on one contract that may change over time as technology changes or the needs of defence changes, that can be very challenging for those businesses. And my message is we do want more defence companies, I think, in this country. But what we want even more of is more companies doing business for defence, so that you have a greater inflow of non-traditional players, like the ones that you identified, because based then on a diversified mix for those businesses, the investment decisions might become much easier. I also think there's a discussion around, so sorry to terrify the Treasury official, about how do we use private capital in the most effective way. Private capital, particularly around things like infrastructure and the like, can be used over decades in a way that means we don't have to spend precious on-budget taxpayer dollars on things that the private sector can, quite frankly, offer a much greater contribution to. So again, how do we have conversations with maybe the type of people that aren't in this room? What is the architecture on that? Who owns it in government? What is the reference panel for how do we deploy technology and private capital? I think all of these things are great ambitions for a government in its second term. So it might be an incomplete answer, but it's the, as they say in the movie, it's the only one I've got.
Kat, would you like to?
I can say that's something really brief to that, which is, we've been on this quest of engaging private capital more in different kinds of public projects for years. And I guess the main rule to apply there is you can't destroy risk. All you can do is look at different ways of sharing it. And there are most certainly parts of the risk spectrum where the private sector can better manage that burden and you can share it with them. The key thing is around project design and how do you know where those different pockets of risk exist and where you should be having it on the government balance sheet and where you should be sharing it with the private sector.
Can I just add that every sensible company or government agency is looking deep into their supply chain to look for vulnerability. And if you accept that premise, then a business that sounds like those examples you're giving are security add-ons. And so the better posture to be is to have security by design and that you are a much more resilient and ultimately profitable business in the longer term, although that comes with cost up front. And so whether it's government regulating or industry, so many supply chain standards are being set. The Prudential Standard 230 is requiring second, third and fourth party supply chain. The Defence Industry Security Program is requiring people to meet Essential 8 Maturity Level 2. The Critical Infrastructure regime is requiring people to meet a cyber standard. So the economy and the regulatory settings are changing, which should actually, I think, lift the standard and the baseline for business and governments in Australia, which then helps with the level playing field, but also creates a much more resilient economy.
All right, we've got time for one more. Is there one more question on the floor?
There's one over here, John.
There's one here, one here. Oops, sorry, maybe we can get two in. Is there another one over there? I can't see that. Okay.
Thank you. Al Martin, ASPI Medical. ASPI Medical's doing some discrete pieces of work in and around Ukraine. What we're seeing there is, from a healthcare perspective, a whole of nation response, public, private, not-for-profit, all collaborating, and we're seeing that in other areas as well, but healthcare specifically. Chief of Defence Force called out specifically healthcare in respect to conflict and operations from Australia and our northern bases. We have been actively sharing our insights and thoughts on what we're seeing from Ukraine and around the world. Matt, you made the comment that government needs to be better at having discussions with industry. In the context of that and the World Health Organization predicting a shortfall of 11 million healthcare professionals by 2030, we would argue that discussion in the context of our national security needs to be happening now, and I'm sure that there are other industries and sectors that feel the same way. My question is, what is preventing government from having those conversations?
I don't know whether government's being prevented as much as we are only now, I'd say post-pandemic, turning our mind to the national system. the relationship we have with the Department of Health is not a very deep one in defence. But I worked there for a few years, so I know some people, and in fact, I caught up with a former secretary last week to discuss how the national health system can assist us in the ADF, because we have scarcity of health workers, and maybe us trying to have our own health system inside the nation, maybe that's not optimal. But I don't. That's not a direction, please. That's not a policy statement. That's me contesting or checking in with others. Have we got this right? And so in the way JJ talked about the Fuels Council and the work that has, the positive work that has, health is the next area that we do need to discuss, because it is a workforce shortage. In our planning, most of our health workforce are health workers in their day jobs and do reserve work for us. If we have a contingency, they might need to stay in the health system. So we do need to have this conversation, and I know there's some strategy people in the audience who'll write some notes and say we should actually explore that as we generate the next National Defence Strategy. It's a great question.
Does anyone else have a view on that? I might. So, I think it's a really important question. During COVID, we saw, particularly in remote areas of the north, where there was limited capacity for, intensive respiratory care and those sorts of things, how we might, well, we had to move people down, primarily the East Coast, into other sort of care facilities. The National Defence Strategy infers, moving to the north and operating from the north. So there will no doubt be, greater pressures, and it could be, the sorts of, intensive combat type casualties that need to get managed. So there does need to be a more coordinated conversation, and I think that is a good piece of work to have next on the slate.
Can I just add one really quick thing? Sorry, I would also encourage sort of partners in industry to have a look at this across the whole of economy front. So one of the key planks of the government's productivity agenda that's been worked through with the Productivity Commission is around building a skilled and adaptable workforce. One of the key parts that we've already got with the National Competition Policy is around occupational licensing. So it's how do you look at those things under the hood that can actually help move labour around the country? And I know your question was a lot broader than that, but it is having a think about how the sectors that sit in this room fit into that broader national piece, given the need to scale up the industrial base that we've already talked about.
Fantastic. All right, we are coming to an end there, so I would like to thank Matt, Hamish, Andrew and Katrina for your contributions, and I could ask if you all show your appreciation. Good job.